Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Maartje.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it.
Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are discussing a Dutch movie called The Slag om de Schelde, or for you non-Dutch speaking people, The Forgotten Battle, that you can find on Netflix. It is a 2020 war drama about the Battle of the Schelde, which took place in 1944. The movie was directed by Matthijs van Heiningen Jr., with a screenplay by Paula van der Oest, who also this year directed and produced The Joodse Raad, or the Jewish Council. It was one of the few movies to come out during the height of the pandemic, and I'm not sure if it benefited or hurt the movie. I don't think it did what they hoped it would do, which is a shame, really.
I'm actually really glad that you read that part because I would not have been able to pronounce any of those names.
In this movie, we follow three different viewpoints, which is interesting on its own. But we follow a resistance girl, we follow a Dutch boy who fights for the Germans, and we follow a British glider pilot, as they all have a part to play in the Battle of the Schelde. The Battle of the Schelde was a military operation that took place from October the 2nd to November the 8th, 1944. The main goal of the battle was to open the port of Antwerp to Allied forces, because they needed the port of Antwerp to shorten their supply lines as they progressed into Germany.
So, what did you think of this movie?
I think it's pretty good, actually. I'm very critical about Dutch movies usually, but I really enjoyed this movie specifically because it has such unpopular points of view. I don't think I've seen any other movie with a Dutch boy fighting for the Germans before from a Dutch maker. How about you?
Yeah, I agree. It was definitely some viewpoints that we don't see very often in war media or as much. Obviously, one of the three main characters was a female main character, which I really enjoy because we are constantly complaining on this podcast about not enough stories about women. So I did enjoy that. And I was excited as well because this movie, obviously, or maybe not obviously, the Battle of the Scheldt for the Allies was largely organized and fought by the Canadians. And so there aren't very many Canadian war movies. There for a couple of reasons. I mean, and this is just my opinion, but I think the first one is probably that our film industry, while vibrant and certainly producing a lot of good media, is definitely not anywhere close to the scale of the American movie industry. And war movies tend to be very resource intensive and expensive to make. And the second is that I just don't think that military prowess is a cornerstone of our national identity the way it is in the US. And so, most Canadians could probably name some formative battles, military experiences like Vimy Ridge in World War I, and people know that we stormed the beaches of Normandy and all that. But for the most part, I think Canadians sort of see ourselves in more of a kind of scrappy underdog way. We go to war because we have to, we're peacekeepers, that sort of thing. And whether or not that's true, that's sort of the flavor of the national self-perspective. So yeah, there's not a lot of Canadian war movies, and I was really excited to get to see the Canadians participate in a battle.
I feel like the Canadians often are kind of in the supporting role in war movies. Even in this one, to be fair, even though they set up the whole operation of the Scheldt in the story too, they don't have any main characters.
Yeah, you're right. I did watch this movie and I was like, oh wow, you had the opportunity to make the allied character Canadian, but you made him British. That's fine, I guess. I'll allow it, I suppose.
Yeah. I wanted to mention one more thing also before we get into this movie and get into some more background details. But I really liked about this movie that the resistance girl that's in this, Dainte, which is a very Dutch name that's not used very often anymore. She's a very reluctant hero, doesn't really want to be in the resistance. He doesn't want to do any of it, really, until she absolutely has to. I like that choice to make her almost an accidental hero in this.
Yeah, I think so often people forget that I believe in World War II, there were, I think, 60 million people were killed and 45 million of those were civilians. And people, I think, sort of almost don't think about that side of things as much, that there were people just going about their day-to-day lives in a war zone. And people had to make very like nuanced, complicated decisions every day based on their survival.
So the writer of this movie also said, it's an uncomfortable truth, but during the war, more Dutch people died in German service than in the resistance. That's where myth-making comes in again. People like to think that we were all super opposed to this war, right? But there were also a lot of people agreeing with the Germans or just operating so they could save their own lives or their families' lives. So it's an uncomfortable thing, but it's still true.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about a movie where the whole point of it is not necessarily that everyone involved is a hero or is necessarily doing heroic things.
Like, even the British character isn't particularly heroic in this.
Yeah, and we'll definitely, I think, get into it a little bit when we talk about the plot. I wanted to provide maybe a little bit of context first, if that's cool.
Yes, please. It's called the Forgotten Battle for a reason. Even in the Netherlands, we don't know anything about this.
So I have a big map open in front of me because just all of this, I think, I didn't know the details. And I think it's good for us to provide context because the Battle of the Scheldt is so central in this movie. So the Port of Antwerp is a deep water inland port in the north of Belgium. And it's kind of like right on the border with the Netherlands. And it's connected to the North Sea via the River Scheldt. So you have essentially the North Sea, which is the big body of water between the UK and Europe. And then Antwerp is a port, but it's not right on the coast. It's kind of inland a little bit. So you need to travel down the river to get there. And during World War II, by the time D-Day rolled around, it was the largest surviving port in Western Europe at that time, because a lot of them, of course, were being shelled by either side, depending on whose hands it was in. So a lot of them had been destroyed. So the Germans constructed what was probably the strongest concentration of defenses the Nazis had ever constructed in order to defend it on the Walcheren Peninsula, which kind of sits at the mouth of that estuary into the North Sea. So there's sort of a peninsula that splits the River Scheldt between the East Scheldt and the West Scheldt. And right at the end, there's an island. It's not an island anymore, I don't think, but it was an island called Walcheren. And that's where the Germans were really dug in and fortified. And they had also mined the river. So even if you held the city of Antwerp, you would not be able to bring ships down the river because the Germans held that part.
I'm going to break in for just 1 second and just give you the Dutch pronunciation of the island for fun.
Yeah.
You won't have to say it again after this sound, but it's pronounced Walcheren.
This is why we need to have Mart on the podcast. This is crucial because I'm just absolutely butchering it. People are going to be like, what is she talking about?
Yeah, so whenever we hit one of those really Dutch words, I'll just break into this explanation and tell you.
Perfect. Save my life. Yeah. So Hitler's intention was to hold this island and the peninsula at all costs. It was like, this is do or die. We have to keep this because if the Allies are able to take control of it, they're going to be able to bring in all of their supplies. And just to give you some idea, in the month after D-Day, the Allies, and when I say there was like 1 million, the Allies literally had brought in 1 million personnel over to Europe, like 500,000 tons of supplies, hundreds of thousands of tons worth of vehicles. And so that's a huge logistical nightmare to deal with. And in the first few months after D-Day, they managed to capture 500 miles of territory. So that's a long supply line. So having access to the port of Antwerp is going to be huge. I mean, that's the whole thing with war, right? It's like one of the things that people don't always think about. It's a huge logistical problem as well. Allied advance into Germany would basically be impossible without holding the Antwerp port due to the supply lines. And in the fall of 1944, the British and the Belgian resistance had actually seized the port of Antwerp, but they did not have control over the peninsula and the island. So they had the port, but they couldn't get any ships in there because the Germans held all of the territory in between the port and the sea.
And it's pretty much useless.
Right, exactly. Like, what are you going to do? And General Montgomery, who's the commander of the British 21st Army Group, had been told by the powers that be in late summer 1944 to make the Scheldt his main priority, but instead he focused his time and resources on Market Garden. And
I'm making a face, by the way. I'm just being like, why?
Yeah. I mean, hindsight's 2020, I guess, but if everyone remembers from our Band of Brothers episodes, Market Garden was a failed attempt to a huge airborne invasion, and it was not successful. So Montgomery poured all of his time and resources into Market Garden. And because of that, because the British had essentially taken Antwerp and then stopped to divert their resources from Market Garden, the Germans had time to really dig in. And that made it a huge goddamn hassle for the Allies to take it back from them after that. Montgomery had told the Canadian First Army to prioritize taking Boulogne, Calais, and Dunkirk, which were some other ports. And some historians actually consider this to be the greatest tactical error in the war. Because, yeah, it's a big one. Yeah, in the weeks after D-Day, it was really crucial of them to get control of this port. And just to give you some idea of how strategically valuable it was to both sides, after the Battle of the Scheldt, in which the Allies, spoiler alert, did manage to take it back, the Germans immediately began planning the Ardennes offensive, which, as we know, was the Battle of the Bulge that took place in December. And the Germans began planning that right after the port of Antwerp was taken. And the goal was to take Antwerp back. So that was kind of the goal of the last big thrust of the Germans, essentially. And nearly half of the V2 rockets launched during the war were aimed at Antwerp. And as we know, the V2s kind of came into existence towards the end of the war. So you can tell that the Germans this is where they were focusing their last gasp, so to speak.
Yeah, it's funny to think about if this Battle of the Scheldt had not happened and the Allies had not won. I think the war might have ended differently.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, it's tough, right? Because there's all kinds of battles that you could say that about, but it definitely would have made things a lot harder because all along the French coast, all of those ports were either super heavily fortified because the Germans had been holding them for like 4 years, or they had been destroyed. So there was really no other option at this point.
So that should give you some background information to this movie, which is all about the battle, which we'll talk about more later. But maybe we should just kind of dive into the movie by starting with our three main characters that we follow throughout this movie, and their storylines kind of intertwine and move apart and intertwine and move apart. Our first character is Teuntje Visser, who's played by Suzanne Radder. She's a young woman living in Zeeland, which is where this battle takes place. And she has a brother called Dirk, and her father is a doctor. And when we meet her for the first time, her father is kind of working with the Germans, and her brother is taking some photos of some Germans, and we kind of learn fairly quickly that he might be involved in the resistance. But Teuntje is pretty reluctant to do anything. And the second character we follow is Marinus van Staver, and these are all names that we never use anymore, by the way. He is played by Gijs Blom, who's probably the biggest young actor in this movie, at least as far as Dutch actors go. And he's also in another Netflix production called Letter to the King, which unfortunately was cancelled after one season, but he plays the villain in that, if you're interested. His character is a Dutch volunteer fighting for the German army. He's kind of disillusioned with the Nazi ideology that he at first believed in, and he struggles throughout the movie to decide whether he wants to be with the Germans or if he kind of regrets his decision. And his motivations are really interesting. Maybe we can come back to that later. And then the third and last character we follow is the British glider pilot called William Sinclair. He's played by Jamie Flatters. He was supposed to go to Operation Market Garden in his glider, but it kind of goes awry and he has to make his way through the land to find some Canadians.
Canada mention.
Yes.
Just to go through a little scene by scene, we start with our opening sequence, which gives us kind of some context. It's a graphic and text that tells us the importance of the Battle of the Scheldt, kind of what was happening before this. They show a map, which is super helpful. In order to understand this battle, you pretty much have to have a map open in front of you. And it depicts the shifting territories held by the two sides as things progress. And I just wanted to note, they denote the Canadians with a maple leaf flag, which was not actually created until 1965. Our flag during World War II was the red ensign or the Union Jack, depending on what it was being used for. And you'll see that the Canadian soldiers in the film do not have a flag, like a national flag on their uniform. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's probably to explain it to us dumb Dutchies, basically.
Well, yeah, I get why they did it. It's obviously much more clear, but I just watched it and I was like, oh, that's interesting.
I think it's funny because this map thing is our main gripe with basically any other war movie we've seen. And now we
Right.
actually know where we are. I also
Yeah.
like how it fades into the actual places we're going to. In the first scene after the map, we follow German boats as they retreat towards Zeeland, which is where our first main character, Teentje Visser, lives, under German occupation in Holland. And the Dutch, we think we're about to be liberated. So we're pretty happy at this point. We're like, yay, they're leaving.
Yeah, you see
But,
people in the streets kind of, being a bit more mouthy against German officers than they would normally be. And they pull a guy out of a truck or something and they're giving him shit because he's a collaborator. So you can tell that people are starting to be a bit more brave than they would have been before.
They make a mention in the scene of the NSB, which is the National Socialist Movement, who agreed with the Germans. So
Right.
those are like the official collaborators.
Yeah, I would
Like
because I mean the Nazis are also the National Socialist Party. I assume it's like a breakaway sort of piece
yeah,
of the same party.
I have some background information on this if we want to include it. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the Nationaal Socialistische Beweging is the Dutch word. It's the National Socialist Movement. Officially, it's not a political party, but they erupted after the Depression as a party to oppose the current government. You know how it goes. Many people were unhappy, and this party was like, we can promise you jobs and a better life and all that kind of stuff. It started out how many opposing parties do, from a source of general unhappiness and like playing off of that. I'm not sure if people knew what they were getting into when they joined initially, but later on, definitely it was well known what the movement stood for. And a lot of people still joined and stayed, which is really harmful. This movie jumps around a lot between these three main characters, so if it's confusing, we're very sorry, but you will just have to watch the movie. Because shortly after we meet Teentje Visser and her dad, we also meet Marinus, who is the Dutch boy volunteering in the German army, and he's fighting on the Eastern Front, which we haven't seen much of yet in our quest to watch lots of war movies. So it's interesting. And he's losing the battle that he's in, and he loses his friend, who's called Lucas, and he also gets kind of shut up a little bit. So he wakes up in a hospital where he befriends a Nazi officer called Friedrich Fischer, played by Pit Bukowski, who has an interesting quote from Joseph Goebbels.
Yeah, so he quotes this line about propaganda that says, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it.
And the interesting thing about this man is that he's a Nazi officer who has lost his faith. He's lost both his legs. And you can tell that he no longer believes in what the Nazis are fighting for. And he also says he feels useless. But he mentions having been a guard at Telmo, I think you would pronounce it maybe, I don't know, Poland, which was the first extermination camp and the first one to use gas. It's a pretty nasty camp. As they're talking in the hospital, Fisher actually befriends Marinus a little bit, and he's like, so you think you're so cool, you're a Dutch boy and you're fighting here, what are you, on holiday or something? But you can see that he cares about this boy who's clearly here not knowing what he's doing there, and he gets him a desk job back in Holland, but then shortly after, he takes his own life. Pretty rough to watch, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. But just another more nuanced take, I guess, than you would normally see. Just a perspective that is not shown that much, I would say, in war media.
No, and I think this is the same scene, but we see Marinus. I should just say it in Dutch, by the way. I keep doing the English pronunciation. Marinus. We see him having a couple of flashbacks as he's sleeping, I think, to his home. I don't quite know for sure. It's quite a dark scene, but I think he leaves his home in the middle of the night. But he talks to Fisher about the reason why he joined the Germans.
He says that he enlisted because he was tired of his family having to work hard and having nothing to show for it and having no future. Wouldn't this have been such a common refrain in the wake of the Great Depression? no matter where you were in the world. Like, isn't it grim how ruling classes everywhere seem to have found this specific way to exploit the working classes into killing each other? It's like you were saying, a lot of people joined this party because they were sick of things being hopeless and they wanted things to change. And so often that's the case. When people become reactionaries, that's why. I think it's crucial to remember that for a lot of people, it's not about whatever high-minded principles there are. It's really about their day-to-day lives. People will take advantage of that, powerful people, political leaders. And worth noticing as well that his reason for enlisting is just so plain and ordinary and familiar to us. You look at something like that and you're like, oh, Nazis, they're just like us. And then you have to be like, oh, they're just like us.
It's so true, and it makes it all the more scary, doesn't it?
One thing that's important about the way they tell the story in this movie is that I mean, in my opinion anyways, it's not about humanizing the Nazis for their benefit. It's not about making them sympathetic or giving them credit. It's about telling these stories where, their motivations are familiar or they seem relatable in some way so that they're recognizable to us, so that there needs to be an understanding that Nazis didn't come here in a spaceship from like planet fascist. They're not space aliens, they're people. And it's important that we're vigilant about this, because as soon as you start thinking they're monsters and we're not, we could never be, we have some innate special thing that means we could never fall prey to this kind of thing, that's when we're in the most danger.
I agree. I don't think I've ever met a Nazi before, but they really could be your neighbor if you're not careful. You really have to be like on the lookout for people who look like they're nice people, and they could be perfectly nice people and then have this dark story about them that we don't even know about. So I think this movie does that nicely too, where Marinus is a perfectly nice boy, except he follows this party with this crazy ideology that is really bad and he doesn't even see it.
Yeah, exactly. There's a quote by, I believe she was a journalist named Naomi Schulman, and she says, "Nice people made the best Nazis. My mom grew up next to them. They got along, refused to make waves, looked the other way when things got ugly, and focused on happier things than politics. They were lovely people who turned their heads as their neighbors were dragged away. You know who weren't nice people? Resistors." British glider pilot William Sinclair prepares for Operation Market Garden. We immediately see that he doesn't take himself very seriously. The trope of a pilot doing risky, dangerous shit to show off, like we saw in Pearl Harbor. It's kind of a shorthand for the character's whole personality. Like, this is a really common trope in war media. And we also meet British officer Tony Turner, as played by Tom Felton, and he's a friend of William. Tony insists that William's father has to give permission in order for William to go to Operation Market Garden. And William says, "Oh yeah, I got permission. I talked to my dad." And either Tom Felton's character is just like the dumbest man of all time, or he is just like, well, whatever, fuck it. Like, he says he got permission, I'll believe him. And his friends also give him shit about, his dad being a big, important general and all that.
I think it's smart that they mention Operation Market Garden for this, because it kind of roots the story in something familiar in the beginning, because like I said, even Dutch people have no clue about this battle that happened in our country. I mean, I'm sure people who live there will know, but people who live where I live have no clue.
Yeah, it's the fall of 1944 right now, in case anyone's not following.
We switch back to our other main character, Toontje, or rather her brother Dirk, who's played by Ronald Coulter. He gets in a little bit of trouble because we meet him outside and he's taking photos of the retreating Germans with his fancy camera. And then one of the Germans knocks it out of his hands and he gets angry and throws a rock through the windshield of a Nazi truck. And he ends up killing 3 Germans with that action and has to run away. So Toontje actually witnesses this with her friend Jana. So Toontje waits for Dirk to come back home. She knows he might be injured, so she waits for him to come home. He's being a little bit standoffish, but then Toontje realizes that he might be part of the resistance, and she also learns that her friend Jana might know some people, which is what Dirk tells her, because she suggests that he goes into hiding because they're all looking for him. And I nearly glossed over a part, actually, because while they're looking for Dirk, 3 other boys that have nothing to do with the incident are being arrested, which sounds really cruel, but did actually happen in our occupation a lot.
Yeah. So we sort of flip back to Marinas, and his German officer friend, as we said, got him a desk job in, I'm gonna get you to say this name.
Vlissingen, which is also where Tanger lives, by the way.
Yes. And he crosses paths with her as the Germans zero in on her brother. Essentially, her and her dad end up going to the German commander to try and beg for Dirk's life. And then Marianus is working in that office. So you sort of start to see him struggle with his conscience. Like, he's witnessing Dirk's father trying to bargain for Dirk's life. It's kind of heartbreaking. And then we flip over to William's point of view. We see his glider crash behind enemy lines, and him and his compatriots, including Tony, who's been wounded, hole up in a barn and later in a house in a flooded village. And a farmer informs them that the Canadians have entered Holland. So they decide that they're going to head for the Canadian lines because they don't really know where else would be a good sort of rally point.
Yay,
and I made a little note in here. Yeah, yeah, excited. Always excited about a Canada mention. I made a little note in here about gliders because you kind of see them in the movie. They're sort of built like planes, but they're smaller and lighter, and they're attached to other planes in the air by a rope. And gliders were an improvement on paratroops because you could guarantee that the people and supplies would all be dropped together. And as we've discussed in Band of Brothers, SAS Rogue Heroes, if you're just dropping like one guy out of a plane, number one, he can't carry a lot of supplies. And number two, like, you might drop him 5 or 10 or 15 miles away from the other guys. And so gliders would make sure that all these people and supplies would be dropped together. And they could even carry big stuff like anti-aircraft guns, jeeps, light tanks. And obviously they had no engine, so they were silent, and they were semi-expendable. So oftentimes they were made of lighter materials like wood, so it wouldn't be quite as costly as losing a plane. And they ended up being replaced in later conflicts with helicopters. So if you just think of that, that was kind of their use at the time.
I also have something more to say about this scene particularly, because what people don't realize is that Zeeland and the river, but also countryside, was mostly flooded by the Germans to make it almost inaccessible for the Allies. So this battle in general, but also their crash landing, was in water, and it's really difficult to move around in. As you can also tell if you watch this movie, it's really, really difficult. You've switched back to Taintje again, because her father, who's a doctor, thinks that his negotiations were successful because the German commander actually told him, give him a light sentence, which he won't do, spoiler alert. But thinking that he was successful, he convinces Dirk to turn himself in, which is pretty sad and made me cry, to save the lives of the other boys that have been captured. But as Dirk is saying goodbye to Taintje, where she does a lot of pretty crying, I want to say, he tells her that there's something hidden in their basement underneath the table, and he tells her to look for it and to give it to her friend Jana, who works in a bakery. So those were actually photographs that he's taken of like the German gun nest. So he gets taken away, and it's sad, but of course you kind of hope that he'll be okay, but he really isn't. He gets subjected to really harsh interrogation, and he ends up giving up the names of 5 fellow members of the resistance. And Marinus once again actually witnesses him being tortured, which you can see deepens his conflict. And the officer who tortures him is called Degener. He's played by Jacob Diel. And I wanted to mention him specifically because he's in many other war movies and series, like In Westen nicht Neues, The Jewish Council, All the Light We Cannot See, The Conference, which is another war thing we could watch later, and he's even on Masters of the Air, so he's been all around as basically the same character all the time.
Imagine being typecast as a Nazi, R.I.P.
Yep, not fun, but he's very good. He's very menacing. I haven't seen any of his other stuff apart from All the Light We Cannot See, which I can't really remember, and also In Westen nicht Neues, which I also can't remember him in, and Masters of the Air, but I really don't know him. So.
My clearest memory of All the Light We Cannot See is Mark Ruffalo's ungodly British accent. So Everything else I
Oh,
just blocked out.
it's illegal. I feel like it should have been banned from production.
Why was he playing a French character with a terrible English accent? Just let him sound like an American.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, once he's given up the names, it also becomes very clear to us, the audience, that he's not going to survive. So Danger doesn't know this yet, but she tries to secure his release by taking the photographs to Yana, but instead of giving it to her, she insists that the resistance help her brother. So even then, she's kind of fighting the resistance a little bit. And they kind of give her an ultimatum instead. They say, we'll try and rescue him, but only if you steal him up for us from the mayor's office. Which she goes and she does, which was pretty exciting. And meanwhile, Dr. Visser still believes he can get his son released, which that scene made me cry too. Really hard to watch.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously he works at a hospital. So he's a doctor and he's treating everyone the way you're supposed to, but certainly has, had a sort of go along to get along attitude with regard to the Nazi occupiers. And now that push comes to shove and he has to sort of rely on that friendly relationship, he finds that no, in fact, they're actually not on your side after all. And it doesn't matter how much you collaborated with them or how well you treated them or whatever, they're not going to come down on your side. So that's kind of it's tough to watch.
And it's interesting that you say this because in the Jewish Council, which is a Dutch show about them, it's a bit too long to get into now, but the same thing happens to people who try and kind of make a deal with the Germans and try to do what they say in hopes it'll help the Jews in Amsterdam. It doesn't help one bit. So it's just brutal, really. And also within the family, I feel like Dirk actually says to Tantje in the beginning of the movie, when Tantje says something about her father being able to help him, he says very bluntly to her, no, but our dad works for the Germans. So he was very obviously not on the same side, which would have been true too for many families. It's such a difficult thing to decide, to either agree with the Germans or to just do the bare minimum to survive or to not do anything at all. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah.
All the people that Dirk accidentally named in his torture also get arrested. One of them gets away, but Marinus once again notices what's going on and he runs outside to tell Tantje that her brother is going to die. It's a tricky thing to watch because everybody is having a really bad time.
He ends up getting fired from his desk job, Marinus, and he gets forced to shoot Dirk. And it's starting to be clear that he's really regretting joining the Germans. And we switch to William's point of view. And at this point, they're down to 3 members of their original crew because 2 of the guys left in the middle of the night. They weren't really on board with the plan to go to the Canadian lines. So they left, and William and his Dutch compatriot Hank, as played by Cohen Brill, they leave Tony behind. As we recall, Tony's been wounded. So they leave him behind while they go and find a boat in this flooded village. And they don't succeed in finding a boat. And when they come back, Tony's been captured by 2 Germans. And William kills them both. And the scene it's rough. It's one of those things where I feel like you can see a million battle scenes where all these guys are getting mowed down and, it's a battle scene. You've seen it before. But this is sort of this up close and personal, visceral, this is the first person that he's ever killed. He has to do it to save the lives of his friends. It's really, they have a knockdown, drag out, like fist fight first in this waist deep water, and he ends up shooting him. And then when he goes to shoot the second guy, it ends up getting Tony killed. And it's just brutal. It's a really tough to watch scene.
It's actually even worse than that because he doesn't kill the first soldier until Tony gets killed. So he kills him in like a revenge kind of thing. So the first soldier he kills is the one that's holding Tony. And then he sees that Tony's dead and he kind of that flips the switch for him to also kill the second guy.
Right.
So it's just, I think it's an interesting way to show how soldiers or how people maybe aren't made for killing. You can tell them, all of them, even the Germans, are reluctant to shoot each other.
Right. You can give people all the training in the world, but it's hard to until you're face to face with someone and you have to do it, it's hard to kind of put someone in that mind frame and difficult as well, I think, when it's someone who's your age who kind of looks like you. I mean, we'll probably get into this in later episodes, but the Pacific Theater of War, there was like a heavy layer of racism all over that side of it. And then it was different over here, right? It's like you're a white person fighting against other white people. They remind you of people that you know. So, of course, it puts all these barriers in place in terms of having to end a life.
Yeah, and we learn also, like the night before they have a conversation, I think, that William is only 18 too, so it's really young. So all of these soldiers would have been really young. But I think it's nice that they don't make this killing thing into a heroic act in this at all. It's purely an absolute necessity, and it's hard for them on both sides.
Yeah, it's bloody and sad. It's one of those things that someone will carry with them for the rest of their lives. So yeah, William and Hank end up taking the Germans' boat once they've both been killed, and Hank ends up not opting to come with William across the water, and so William has to go and find the Canadians by himself.
It's funny because he found the one Dutch guy. I still don't understand why he's Dutch, by the way, but he's Dutch.
Well, I think he's British, but his family's Dutch or he speaks Dutch or something.
Yeah, he sounds pretty Dutch. But they found the only guy who can't swim in the Netherlands, which is one of the reasons why he doesn't want to go. But also, when he doesn't go, you can kind of tell that he's very likely to end up being killed because there's nowhere to hide and there's nowhere to go because everything is flooded. Another one of those strange. We never find out what happens to him, by the way. We have no idea. Just gets left behind.
Yeah. So learning of Dirk's death after her father gets back, she joins the resistance fully as one escaped member of the resistance gives her this map that she had originally stolen in order for them to save her brother. So he gives her this map of the channel with the positions of the German batteries on it and tells her, like, look, someone has to bring this to the Allies. And then we switch back to William and we see him join the Canadians in the battle for the Slow Dam, which is a 1.6 kilometer long and 40 meter wide causeway between the islands of Walcheren and South Beveland. And we also see the battle from Marinus' side. He's in the entrenched German position as a machine gunner. So we're seeing kind of William as they make the advance, and then we're seeing Marinus on like the defender side.
The dam we are talking about is called the Sloedam in Dutch, and it connects the island of Walcheren to Zuid-Beveland or South Beveland, if you want to be English about it.
It's interesting because Antwerp itself is in Belgium, but the sort of peninsula and the island and the estuary leading in is part of the Netherlands because it's right on the border.
And I was talking to Sam before this podcast, and I said something kind of maybe a little bit mean about Teun, or the actress who plays her, that I liked her better when she wasn't speaking. But apparently, the Zeeuwen, which are the people from Zeeland, talk like this. They have this very kind of monotone, kind of subdued way of speaking, which to me kind of came across as being a little bit bored or uninterested, but it's just the way they speak. So I take it back.
So we see Teun get captured by the Germans as she sacrifices herself to make sure that her friend Jana, as played by
Martha Snyder,
so she can escape with the crucial maps the Allies will need so that they can skip attacking the Slow Dam and instead make an amphibious landing on the island. And then we'll flip back to William. He's watching as Jana is brought into the Allied hospital, and the documents, including that map of the channel, are given to the major, and Jana dies. But the information that she's passed on allowed the Allies to reformulate their attack to hit the causeway as a distraction from simultaneous amphibious landings intended to flank the Germans.
I really like this scene, especially from William, because he's looking at Jana and she's lying on a stretcher. You can tell that she's dying, but he can't get herself to look at her. I don't know if you noticed this, but I feel like he's just such an inexperienced boy. He's just like, I've made a mistake by coming here. I shouldn't have been so reckless. Now I'm here and I have to deal with it, and I don't want to do it. So he keeps hiding his face in his hands as she's dying. And then when
Yeah.
she finally dies, he looks at her. But it just makes me sad for all these young soldiers. So many of them were so young. It's so insane to think about.
Yeah. And this is the
And this
first
is
time this plotline intertwines with the other ones as well.
And that's very true because he's been on his own basically for a long time. I also like this because we get a dialogue from the Canadians and I think Highlanders or something. I don't know for sure. I looked this up and I already forgot. But I think the
Yeah.
Scots were also involved in this.
Well, so when I say that the Canadians planned and carried this out, they did have attached contingents that were British, Polish. There were some Americans there, I believe. But all of the Canadian military regiments, they all have British names. So there's like the Highlanders, the Black Watch, there'll be like Irish ones. They all have names because, I mean, so many Canadians come from that part of the world. So the name of the regiment is not necessarily an indicator that it's not Canadian.
Right, but we do hear someone with a very Scottish accent.
Yes.
We should mention why the Sludam was so hard to cut across for the Canadians. It's because the Germans first they had blown a crater into the half point of it, so there was a huge hole in the middle of it, and they had also put up some defenses on the bridge, and just lots of really well positioned guns. So Canadians could either go straight into the guns or, which is what they need the map for, go to the side of it, try and surprise attack these Germans.
Right. Try and flank them with an amphibious landing. Yeah. And a lot of the land around it, a lot of this fighting happened in fields where like generations of Belgian and Dutch people had built dikes and like raised the roads and drained all of this farmland that's below sea level. And so you're having to deal with, these like canals, bridges, like this low-lying swampy land. Everything was mucky. So yeah, it was just really, really rough terrain to fight in.
I believe it was one of the messiest, bloodiest battles of the Second World War.
People who had participated in World War I said it reminded them, it was reminiscent of a World War I battle.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's right. So Marinus is still on the other side, right? He's still fighting with the Germans and he's shooting at the Canadians and you can tell he's feeling bad about it. And anytime he just slightly befriends anyone, they die because one soldier gets killed by our favorite SS officer because he doesn't want to get up or something. I don't remember. It was something stupid, but it's basically a boy. And Marinus actually screams when it happens. You can tell he's ready to get out of there, but it's really tough for him to get out. But eventually the Canadians prevail. Marinus decides to take a hike, but he's followed by our friend William.
It's worth noting that, for Marinus, he has put all of his eggs in one basket here. So if the Germans don't win, he has to face the fact that his family doesn't want to see him again, as we saw in the flashback, that he's betrayed his countrymen. And he's just at a point in the war where he might not believe in this anymore, but it's really all that he has left.
Yeah. And that makes me think, too, there's another thing I like about this movie. It's not like when we see him in the hospital for the first time and this SS guy tells him that maybe he's been kind of misled. He doesn't immediately turn around and go back to the Netherlands and do something stupid, heroic or something. He just goes along because he doesn't see how he can get out of it. And I think would be pretty realistic. It's not easy to get back out.
Yeah. So he and William encounter one another in a field or something. I can't remember if it's tall grass, and there's sort of a tense moment where they're pointing their weapons at each other. And then they just lower their weapons and let each other go. There's no one watching. There's no sense to killing the other person. So they just each go their own separate way. And Marinus finds Thun, as if you'll recall, she's been arrested by the Germans because they caught her trying to deliver that map to the Allies. So Marinus finds her. She's about to be killed or hurt by a German officer. And Marinus finally redeems himself. He has his redemption arc completed. He rescues her, but ends up being fatally wounded in the process.
I feel sad for him, even though he was on the side of the Germans for the wrong reason.
Right. Well, I mean, I think this movie does a good job of making all these people into real people that, everything is nuanced and there's not necessarily a really easy. Everybody's human. Everybody has their flaws and their things about them that are relatable or that you might identify with. So William encounters the two of them as Marinus is dying and Toon is trying to help him, but he can't really be helped. He's beyond that point. And William encounters them, and this is the only time that all three of their plot lines intersect at the same time as the Canadian forces move through to clear the area. Of course, Marinus dies, and it's left unclear at the end of the movie what's going to happen to our two survivors, William and Toon. And then the end cards tell us that the port at Antwerp was open to Allied ships after the battle was won, and that the Netherlands was liberated in May of 1945. So just to give an overview of the Battle of the Scheldt, like Mart was saying earlier, there's a reason why it's called the Forgotten Battle and might be less well known to people. It started on October 2nd of 1944 and it dragged on until November 8th, 1944. And as we said, it was the Canadian First Army, but it also had attached Polish, Belgian, Dutch, and British units. And the Canadian commander was Lieutenant General Guy Simons. And the belligerents in this case were the German Army and Navy forces led by General Wilhelm Daser. And they were fighting over this flooded, muddy terrain. As we said, the operations were extremely bloody and costly. And they were trying to take over this peninsula and island so that they could clear the river of mines, and then the Allies could come in and use Antwerp as a port. The plan for opening the estuary involved four main operations. The first one was to clear the area sort of to the north of Antwerp and secure access to South Beveland, which is the first part of the peninsula leading out to the island. And in that first week and a half of fighting, it was brutal. I mean, all these operations were rough, but on October 13th, 1944, it became known as Black Friday because one of the Canadian regiments, the Black Watch, a third of its men were killed, including all four company commanders. And one company of 90 men had only 4 men present and fit for duty the next day. So,
holy crap.
Yeah,
That's
it was
right.
a gory one. Yeah. So that was the first part. And then the second part of the plan was to clear the Breskens pocket behind the Leopold Canal. So this is kind of to the south of the river. There was like a pocket of German defense there. So this was called Operation Switchback, and knew they had to clear that out. The third part of the battle was the capture of South Beveland. And as we said, that's sort of the first part of the peninsula leading out to the island. And that was Operation Vitality. And then the final phase would be the capture of Walcheren Island itself. And that's what gets depicted in the movie. And that was Operation Infatuate. And so all these different operations were really rough. They got to the end of the battle, and the German commander who ended up being captured by the Allies without firing a shot, after Hitler had told him to hold it at all costs. And he was sending his guys out on essentially suicide runs, but he was captured. And he said to the Canadian commander something to the effect of, well, it took you guys a long time. Like, why didn't you throw more guys at this? What was going on? And the Canadian commander is like, well, I lost 700 guys in 5 days. I was trying to manage casualties and, save lives. And the German commander sort of sneeringly was like, well, we don't care about that in the Wehrmacht. Like, it's all about winning. And so really a big part of the Canadian strategy was that they were trying to save lives because the Canadian government had promised Canadians that there wouldn't be conscription and like overseas conscription. So they did have the draft, but if you were drafted, they were like, okay, you don't have to go overseas. And so they knew that if they lost Canadians, like they wouldn't be able to replace them. So a huge part of this whole let's be cautious and let's rely more on artillery, let's go slow. A lot of this was we just logistically speaking have to save lives. We can't afford to lose more guys.
So overall, it did end up with an Allied victory, obviously, but the Allies lost almost 13,000 people in this battle, which is a lot. But they did take 41,043 German POWs, which is also pretty impressive to me. Besides military casualties, there were also quite a lot of civilians killed in this battle. And there were 2,283 civilians killed across all the regions that this battle took place in, which is a lot of civilians.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like we were talking about before, definitely worth mentioning as part of the human cost of all of this.
I think what this movie does as a whole, or at least what the writer said that it wanted to do, is they want to teach a new generation that it is dangerous to simplify reality. The right and wrong are not black and white concept, but there is a large gray area, which I think we talked about quite a bit already. But it is true, it's not always as simple as you are the good guy, you are the bad guy, this is wrong, this is right. People have to make really complicated choices sometimes.
Right. And I think it's easy to pass judgment on those choices if it's a situation that you are not in and have never been in.
Very true. I could never, I don't think I would be particularly brave in a war, to be honest. You kind of hope you would be, but I don't think I would be.
Yeah. I mean, who can say, right? Who among us can say unless you're actually in that situation?
Let's hope we don't have to be. We should rate this movie. We're still keeping up with our creative rating system. And today it's going to be how many poorly aimed rocks out of 10?
Yeah. I mean, I think that potentially that The Rock was well aimed in terms of Nazi killing, but poorly aimed in terms of consequences for Dirk afterwards.
And pretty much everybody else in the movie.
Yeah. The whole fallout from that for everybody else too. So, okay, I'll go first. I would rate this movie. I'll give it 7 poorly aimed rocks. I do enjoy some nuance. We've been talking a lot about sort of myth making and storytelling recently, and I like seeing these diverse perspectives that maybe people would not have considered. I like seeing people depicted as real human people with flaws who made decisions that maybe were not necessarily the best decisions at the time, but nevertheless they made them. These were, these characters are fictional, but there are real people who did make those decisions for various reasons. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. I thought it showed the different sides of it really clearly, really well. And it just gives you a lot to think about as a movie. Like it's thematically pretty heavy, but I thought the battle scenes were good as well. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
So I'm going to be really boring and say I also give it 7 poorly aimed rocks out of 10. And for me, it's pretty much the same reason. I like thinking about the movie more than I enjoyed watching it. I think the storytelling wasn't particularly good, but the themes were and the choices were. So it wouldn't be a movie that I'll get to remember as scene by scene, which I'm really bad at to begin with. But I wouldn't very soon watch it again, but I would do research more about this battle. So it's done its job of being informative and being maybe original a little bit, but it's not a very entertaining movie. So that's why it only gets a 7. I think if the story was a little bit smoother, I might have given it a higher rating.
Yeah, it's definitely not a light family friendly romp that you throw on, on the weekend because you just want to turn your brain off. That's for sure.
No, it's not like say SAS Rogue Heroes or Band of Brothers that you could just watch over and over again. It's not that kind of movie.
No, but I'm glad it exists. I think that these kinds of works are important and necessary. And you know me, I always love a Canada mention.
Yes, I also enjoyed the Canada mention and the Dutchies, to be honest, even though I hate Dutch movies.
So thanks for listening. You can follow us at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast on Instagram. You can subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts and give us 5 stars. Are you reading anything interesting this week?
I am listening to an audiobook of George Orwell's 1984 as read by Andrew Garfield and loads of other cool people. So that's been fun.
Yeah, sounds great.
It's really fun. So that's what I'm listening to, and I'm also was reading something. Well, I'm not really reading another book, but I am doing lots of research for our future myth-making episode.
Yes, I am. We had talked, I think during the Saving Private Ryan episode, that I had read a segment of this book looking for the good war, and I was waiting for it to come in so I could read the rest. So I did get it, and I have been making my way through it. It's in service of that episode, but it is also super interesting. And I'm also back in school, so I'm reading CPA Canada, audit and assurance, and corporate finance. And it's a real page turner. It's riveting.
It sounds really exciting.
Yeah.
So next week we're reviewing or talking about Captain America, which might not be what you think about when you think about war movies, but it is in fact a war movie.
Yeah, Captain America, the First Avenger, which takes place during World War II. So it's going to be a little bit of a lighter episode and a follow-up to this one.
We've been doing too much heavy reading, guys.
Listen, we need a little break. That's all it is.
See you next week.
Bye.